You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I've got two guests today, Raymond Moody and Paul Perry. They're co-authors of Proof of Life, Afterlife, which was a very early book talking about near-death experiences, 7 reasons to believe that there is an afterlife. And I found books like this and the concept of near-death experiences to be very comforting. So I think this will be a really great call. And welcome both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you.
Both of you, how did you first have a brush with near-death experiences, if not death itself?
Well, Raymond should start in it before I was. I've been with Raymond for 30 years now.
Yeah.
Doing books, but you go ahead.
Yeah, what happened to me, Richard, just to tell you the truth, due to a long situation, my dad came home from World War II, Pacific Theater, and I gathered, looking retrospectively, figured out that he was kind of hostile toward religion. And so I never had much to do with that, but I got interested in astronomy. And so I just was immune, like the religious stuff. And honest to God, when I went to University of Virginia at age 18, I honestly thought that the notion of an afterlife was just a comic premise, kind of like I honestly did. I didn't know anybody took it seriously. And so went there to study astronomy, which is still a big passion of mine, but quickly got taken away into the philosophy where, I was just, this is my field. Just like reading the first few pages of Plato's Republic, I was hooked. And the Republic culminates in this experience of a warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield. And what is this? And it was obvious that my hero Plato took this seriously. So I asked Professor Hammond, and he said, well, these early Greek philosophers understood that sometimes that somebody who appears dead is somehow revived, and they had studied these experiences, and that Plato took them seriously, and that Democritus, who came a little bit beforehand, who was the atomist, said, yeah, they happen, but he thought this is just a residual biological activity, even when the body appears dead, which is the same debate we have now, right? Except today they call it oxygen deprivation to brain or whatever. But anyway, so I was interested in that, but it never occurred to me that could still be going on. But in February, I think it was, of 1965, I heard about and soon heard the lecture of Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry there, who in 1943 had been pronounced dead for 9 minutes and brought back and had an incredible experience. And when I heard George, he was the finest person I ever knew, really. It was astonishing. To make a long story short, I heard a couple more when I was still in college and graduate school. Then when I got my PhD in philosophy, I started teaching philosophy. I heard these from my students, from my colleagues. People asked me to go to the civic clubs. You hear that? So, I just quickly, and that's how I got interested in this. And
were these all third-party stories, or were these people relating their own experiences to you?
Yeah, they were relating their own experiences that they had when they almost died. And, it does sound odd, doesn't it? Why in, 1969 and 70? Well, the reason is that this experience had always taken place, but only in very rare circumstances. The average fate of somebody who appeared dead was to, go on and be dead. But with the advent of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, I think was the sociological factor in there, as it was, that suddenly just made this boom. And I was right there, and I had that knowledge from my favorite subject, ancient Greek philosophy. And so, the whole Western intellectual tradition began with Greek philosophy. And it's one of the most interesting facts of history to me is that the system of reason that we have that we're using right now as we're thinking through this, right? That was, as everybody knows, a product of Greek philosophers. But what the part of the story that is very little known, but is, it absolutely happened, is that these Greek philosophers, the system of reason we have was shaped by these guys' inquiries into the afterlife question, but in a more active fashion. The early Greek philosophers like Epimenides, Pythagoras, Parmenides, the father of deduction, as it were affiliated with these oracles of the dead. That's what people may remember, that people accused Socrates of probing into things under the earth, and what that meant was calling up the spirits of the dead. And so, it's just an absolutely fascinating story. So that's how I got into it, Richard. How in the world do you put all this together? I've heard thousands of people. And as a logician, I am fully aware of the difficulties of drawing as a logical inference the statement that there is an after. I love A.J. Ayer and David Hume. This is my stuff, and I understand why. It's the proof side of it is, for now, difficult. But where I am on it is that I just give up. I can't think my way out of it. The idea that it's so-called oxygen deprivation to the brain, to me, is people hold on to that explanation because it's something they had to hold on to, right? About something very odd and hard to understand. But the trouble is that it's kind of crutch for these people because in reality, people standing at the bedside of the dying person who are not themselves ill or injured, nonetheless will often empathically co-participate in these experiences. So, that one is a hard one to put together on this idea of Democritus, that it's, invisible biological disturbance.
So, Paul, how did you meet Raymond, and how did you first learn about this?
Well, 38 years ago, I was executive editor of a magazine called American Health Magazine. And it was the most successful magazine of the 80s. And somewhere in there, I was approached by Nat Sobel, who is an book agent that both Raymond and I shared. And I had never heard of Raymond, and Raymond had never heard of me. And Nat asked me if I could help Raymond write a book called The Light Beyond, which was an examination of all the research that had been done since he wrote Life After Life. And I said, I don't know if I'm right for that. I don't have any idea who Raymond Moody is. And Nat told me he was a man who named and defined near-death experience. And I said, I don't know what a near-death experience is. And Nat came back, quick like he always did, and said, well, if you're the editor of a big health magazine, you really need to get educated. You really need to know what a near-death experience is. And so I said, okay, I'll be glad to go talk to Raymond. Raymond lived in Georgia at the time, but I'm not sure if I'm right for this. So I got on a plane one weekend. I flew to Georgia and met Raymond, and we took kind of an instant liking to each other. And he explained near-death experiences to me better than anyone else ever has. And I think that's one of his real strengths, is that he's a wonderful teacher. And I became interested at that point in the subject. And I started writing the book from his notes and from other research that I did as well. And as we finished the book, I realized that there was a vacuum in it, that we didn't have very much at all about children and near-death experiences. And Raymond said, well, I've never done research on children and near-death experiences, but there is a doctor in Seattle, Melvin Morse. And if you're interested in doing a book on that, I'll connect you with Melvin. So he did. And I started playing off of Melvin's research, started doing this book on children and near-death experiences. And what I found was, I figured I would do 1 or 2 books on the subject. But with each book I completed, I would see that there was a vacuum in it. There was another hole to be filled by a book. And this was at the time a largely, I think, untouched area of research, near-death experiences. So I finished this book with Melvin on children and NDEs, and said there's not much about people being transformed. There's not a real any really, really good transformation studies. So Melvin put together a number of physicians in Seattle and all over the country, actually. And we ended up doing a study called the transformation study, where we looked at how people were transformed by having near-death experiences, the long-term transformation, the short-term transformations. And it just went on from there. I kept finding blank spots in any book that I worked on. So I would have to fill those with another book. And in the course of that, it's been 38 years now, I've written 6 books with Raymond. And on this subject, I've written, I think, 16 books on near-death experiences with a variety of doctors for the most part. I like to work with doctors because they understand the research process. They don't take it lightly, as many people do. And they come up with better case studies, better research, and they have a better intellect about this sort of field. So that's been my work with this subject area and also with Raymond as well.
What are some of the holes that you mentioned a few times? Like, I guess one would be near-death experiences of adults versus kids. What were the other ones?
Initially, it was near-death experiences of children, how those differed from experiences with adults. And then Melvin and I started talking about how people were changed over decades by having near-death experiences. And that's when we put together these doctors, a number of doctors who created questionnaires and did interviews and on about how people were transformed. And then after that,
let's do a quick vignette as we go. So what's one story of, or what are commonalities in adults versus kids while they have near-death experiences? Maybe a quick summary.
Yeah, I want Raymond to jump in on this one, but I think one of the ones that was most interesting to me is that a couple of them actually, that there's a decrease in death anxiety. So people who have had near-death experiences have kind of been up the tunnel and know what's up there, and they're less afraid about death than people who have not had near-death experiences. Another one is that they have a higher zest for living, which was defined as being type A. They become very type A, but they don't have the anger. They're hungry for intellect. They're hungry for education. And they tend to have, Melvin always said they tend to have a higher intelligence because they've kind of evolved into higher beings as a result of the near-death experiences. An interesting one for sure was the increase in psychic abilities. That through the research, we found that the average NDE has about 4 times as many verifiable psychic experiences as people who have not had a near-death experience. So a verifiable psychic experience would be, someone wakes up in the morning and they say to their wife, I'm supposed to fly to LA today, but I had this dream that the plane crashed, so I'm not going to fly. And then the plane does crash, and that is a verifiable experience.
Does this happen after they have the NDE? Like it opens them up to those intuitions?
I think that's the case. Yeah, it definitely does. The fact that people are less afraid of death as a result of a near-death experience really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. The fact that they have increased psychic experiences and psychic abilities is kind of a surprise because, for one thing, many people don't believe that psychic abilities even exist, yet they were having verifiable psychic experiences. They also have a greater appreciation of learning. I mean, many people who almost die, and Raymond can touch on this as well, obviously, is that they have a sense of going into a heavenly realm, and the heavenly realm is kind of seeped in education. So you'll find that they go into like a library, they'll even describe it as a library, and they absorb all the information in the world that there is to absorb, they say. Yet when they come out of it, they're frustrated because they've lost a lot of that information, but they still become more appreciative of learning.
Yeah, this is one of the aspects of this is very interesting to me, being a cognitive-sided person, that people who go through this life review say that the primary emphasis that this being of light or love that they're often with what the primary emphasis this being puts is on relationships and the quality of love that somebody has learned to give. But also people say that when they're at one of these in this panorama, when there is some event in which they've been learning something, committed to learning, they said that often, although there are no words here, but they say it's as though this being kind of focuses in on that, and that the thought comes to them, something like, this is very interesting and that even when you come over here, this process of learning and knowledge will continue. And, I've just heard that from lots and lots of people. And as Paul mentioned, in cases where the cardiac arrest went on so long that it makes absolutely no sense. Yeah, I mean, there's just no way to talk about this. I have a friend who, according to her doctor, who knew her very well and became an acquaintance of mine, that she was dead, Ray, he said, for 40 minutes. And I mean, the story is a long time to tell. It would be a long time, but it was an incredible series of events. And then a number of the other people that I've talked with who had these incredibly lengthy and almost inexplicable cardiac arrests from which they are returned, talk about that they become aware of different levels of existence or different levels of reality, as it were. And one of them that is frequently reported is this, as George Ritchie, the first living person I heard this from, he said at that time, I was, he was a very well-educated and very brilliant man. But he said he saw into a realm where people were focused on learning. And he said, there's just no way. He said, if you try to collapse Caltech and MIT and Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all of them into one space, he said, you couldn't even begin to, get a picture of this. And he tried to say that, he said there was one aspect of this place. He said he could actually see these people, if that's what you want to call them, or beings, working on things like I'm working on right now, right? Like a book or creative endeavor. And so George said that in one aspect or area of this place that he compared to a library, he said he saw a section that was on the holy books of the universe. And I know, Richard, that this sounds off the wall. But let me say this. I spent a joyous few years in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. Just fascinating talking with paranoid schizophrenic killers and people who'd been in the National Enquirer. But, and I have seen some crazy things, okay, but George Ritchie and people who've had this experience, this is the opposite of crazy.
Is there any specific knowledge that anyone came back with that they could talk about that surprised you or that surprised them?
Well, it's interesting. George and also my friend Vi both said that there were certain parts of this that they just feel that they were not, it wasn't they shouldn't reveal it. And I've heard that from a number of people, but it's not so much the knowledge transfer as the inspiration it gives to me, at least, that this, this project of knowledge that I've been all my life is, at the end, that this is something that is, will serve one well. But also the great preponderance of this is not about knowledge, and it's about what people say that what this being is interested in is how you have learned to love. Now, also, it's not an thing of judgment. In the cases I have studied, what people say is, people often say, I was in a judgmental mood myself. I saw all these things that I had done in this panoramic review of my life, and I was sharing, I was down on myself, but to this being there with is like the specific phrase I remember one man saying is something like, well, you were learning even then. So that, this is the hard thing to master, this life, and that, it's not a judgmental situation, but rather a learning experience.
Transformation, if I can get in real quick, transformation has another side as well. And that is that people who are transformed, who have near-death experiences, especially fairly profound near-death experiences, they have a higher rate of divorce because they no longer are the same person. But a person who has a heart attack might well be someone who's difficult to be around, or they kind of lord over their wives or their families or other people. And when they come back, they're still type A, but they're kinder and gentler.
Yeah, I've heard people are nicer on the episode. Even animals, I heard, are nicer. I've heard that, yeah, like hardened criminals are nicer. People are usually nicer after they come back from these experiences. And then I believe Bruce Grayson said that even animals that have had near-death experiences are less mean or ferocious.
Oh, interesting. That's interesting. I hadn't heard down that one, but certainly what happens, Richard, is people come back on a mission. Like George Ritchie, the finest guy I ever knew, in 1977, I think it was, he told me the following words. He said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. What he was getting at, as I later kind of figured out, was that even after this vision of life, you come back, a vision of love and light, that you come back and you're still a human being. And as I like to say it, let's face it, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And that does not grow away. People they still have to struggle with that. But the course is up. You know, it really is. I didn't know anyone except one case. I knew somebody before and after, but everybody else I've had to take it from their word or from their relatives and friends' words that there was this transformation.
Richard, it's all like the Christmas Carol.
With Scrooge, yeah.
Yeah, but Scrooge. If you watch if it is a near-death experience, by the way. But if you
it is. You're right.
If you watch that, you see him transform through all of these aspects of his life, and in the end, he's wildly driven to be a nice guy.
Yeah, you're right. And it's funny, he was visited by these ghosts. I wonder if the author knew of near-death experiences or had one, and maybe he was relating a personal experience or someone he knew.
I wouldn't be surprised because they were, they occurred occasionally in the Victorian era. And the guy, one of the romantics, I forgot his name, wrote in one of his books about the near-death experience of his grandmother who almost died and in a drowning. And she told him about seeing the light and seeing her life in review and so on. So there were occasional reports like that. So, he probably would have heard of, but at the same time, that it's something that appeals to people all over the world, as I quickly learned in 1976, Richard.
But what is some of the earliest near-death experiences written about in literature? Like, there's probably ancient ones, right?
Yep. Plutarch has a few of them, but the classic one is Plato's Republic. It culminates in a near-death experience. That, in a way, is what that book is all about. And that's why, I became a philosophy major on about page 7 or 8 of the Republic, then went on to get a PhD in philosophy and to teach philosophy before I went to medical school. So, and Richard, the thing about this is that I think that we're going to know more about this in the future because I think it is now actually possible to reinforce, to influence your near-death experience ahead of time.
Right.
And I know it is, as a matter of fact, but I won't go into full detail except to say that in about 1978 or 79, somewhere in the 70s like that, in the early summer or late spring, I lectured in New Jersey, and the host couple had me at a backyard barbecue, and the woman, who was then in her mid-30s, told me about her cardiac arrest during a gallbladder operation. She was almost died and was resuscitated. But she went into it having read my book, Life After Life. And she said, and as the experience was going on, she said, this is just like the book. And I've heard that, countless times since then. In other words, that people who have a near-death experience after reading about the phenomenon are actually able, when they are in that state, to recall the essence of the stories they heard, which means that knowledge about this phenomenon carries over into the phenomenon itself. Now, I won't go into detail here except to say that very fact is we can now have people go into a near-death experience with a totally different mindset so that they will see the difficulties of formulating it in the current way and will correct for that. Now, it's already happened, but the point is that it happens. And what that means is that in the future, we'll have reports of a different nature that are kind of filtered through a different way of looking at this. And so what that means is that we can actually look at the afterlife from two different angles. That we know that people who have it based on and know from Aristotelian logic to try to describe it, it's a travel narrative, right? I got out of my body, went through a tunnel into a light. That's a travel narrative. But people in the future will see the difficulty of that kind of presentation. And they will have to, just because of new things we know about how to think. And it's already happened. So what that means is we're going to have two kinds of experiential reports to line up side by side. That will give the parallax, as it were. You can kind of triangulate. How in the world do they know that it's 4.3 light years out to Alpha Centauri? Because you can't send homing pigeons or anything out there. Well, the way they know is that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So if you take the measure the angle here, and then you wait exactly 6 months later, you measure it here, you get two different angles, and then you can calculate the distance out there. And now we have a similar kind of way of looking at it that's opening up with near-death experiences. We can actually reformat our mind to think about them in a new way.
Have you ever heard someone that had multiple ones one after another? What happened?
And this is pretty common. When it happens, I've heard a number of cases and it's most commonly, it's people with a cardiac condition over a period of years have multiple near-death experiences because of the problems with their heart. And what you see is that one thing I heard in a couple of those cases, people would say that when the second time it happened, they would say something like, "Oh, here I am again," or, they recognized it from the first time. And also that sometimes people will have near-death experiences in some of the heart episodes and not in others. And why we don't.
The people that have multiple ones, do they get anything additional from the second or third one?
Not universally, Richard, but I've heard that a couple of times that based on or more than a couple, but that based on, what their sense was, there was a progression. Like I said, they'd say, "Oh, here it is again." And so I think one man did tell me something like he said, "I came to understand it better as it went along." Yeah. So there is that, at least in that one man, I remember saying it emphatically. And so, yeah.
Okay.
There are people who are NDE prone. So as Raymond just described, it would be someone who has multiple heart attacks or maybe multiple other things that bring them to the brink of death. And they will, I don't want to say consistently all the time, but they will frequently have multiple NDEs. I think it's referred to as being NDE prone. Can we go back to history for a minute? Because I want to tell us the Mayans. The Mayans used near-death experiences as a form of government. And the way they did it is that if they were facing some kind of a calamity, weather calamity, fire, something like that, or a governmental calamity, they would drain the blood from their kings and sometimes their queens. They would drain the blood in men by taking a sea urchin spike and putting it into an artery underneath the penis. And this is an artery that really flows a lot of blood, put it that way. And they would drain blood from them until they would have contact with their dead relatives. They would try to they would ask the dead relative about what they should do about the particular problem that they here on Earth couldn't solve. And as proof of this, you can go to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. I don't know if they still have it now, but they had a Mayan exhibit up a couple years ago, and it had all the tools and an explanation of how they were used. And frequently their kings would bleed to death.
I was going to ask you, it's a horrible thing to think about, but it's funny. I was just about to ask you this. Like, has anyone contemplated a way of reliably or semi-reliably bringing people to this point where they can have an NDE? It's not, you're playing with fire big time, but it sounds like that's what they were doing.
Yeah, they were doing it. Absolutely. I think there's all kinds of reliable ways to bring people to a point of death, but they're only fairly reliable. How's that?
Oops. Oh, that one didn't go well.
Some frowns on.
Yeah. Well, did the Mayans get reliable intel from their ancestors, or did they write about what they experienced?
I don't know that we could, and it's only been recent that we've been able to understand with Mayan writing how it translates into English or into a European language. But they do have that information on what they saw. Essentially, the consistent way to look at it would be they would try to connect with past kings who possibly had the problem that they were trying to solve now, and they successfully did it. Or they were just trying to rely on their ancestors because in many cultures, I think Mayans were particular. They had a real ancestor worship.
Has anyone hypnotized someone that has had an NDE and then asked them questions about it to see if their recounting of the story was any different?
Yeah. Raymond?
I don't know. I haven't heard about that.
Haven't you done it?
Me?
Yeah.
No, never. Oh, I know what you mean. You mean somebody who's had a near-death experience.
Yeah.
Then to hypnotize them back to yeah. Well, I haven't done that, but I'll tell you why. Because when George Ritchie was a psychiatry resident at UVA, they tried it on him because the professors, some of whom I got to know later, knew George very well. And they all agreed, yeah, this would be interesting. So they put him into a deep hypnotic trance to see if they could recall memories from, that he hadn't had of the experience, but he could hypnotically revive memories of it. But the trouble was that he really started going into cardiac arrest. They say his neck veins extended and everything, so they quickly called it off. And so for that reason, I mean, I heard that from George in probably 1977 or so. That's right. I remember how it came up, but I was specifically mentioning that thought you just had, Richard, about the hypnosis. And George then immediately said, no. So, I mean, I haven't thought much about it.
Well, it seems like it was dangerous, at least for that guy.
Yeah, but also it's there's so many other ways to look at this that aren't dangerous. For one thing, it happens spontaneously all the time at the bedside of the dying. And very often, just as people used to be with near-death experiences, very often these days, the folks with shared death experiences, as I call them, they're kind of reluctant to come forward too. But, it happens all the time that people there at the bedside of somebody who is dying, most often from people they know nearby, because that, how the stories come to me, but also often the stories come from people who were just strangers who happened to be there. For example, incredibly, Richard, I've had quite a number of cases, this doesn't seem that rare, of people who at the bedside of somebody who did pass away, that as the person who was dying had their life review, incredibly the bystanders would have that happen to them to empathically co-live the dying life review as it was usually their close relatives. I heard just this really amazing experience in Carrollton, Georgia in about 1986 or something, who had what you call a Sturgay relationship with her husband. And that's where two people grow up together almost like on adjacent farms or nearby houses. And they grow up as a friendship, a couple, boy and a girl. And then they just sort of naturally evolve into marriage. And when that happens, that's a very difficult situation with the grief so attached. But in this particular case, she was there with her dying husband and told me that as he was passing away, she saw his life review just like she was there with him. Then I've heard other cases. So for some time, I just assumed unreflectively that this has to be somebody very close to the person, as you would think, right? However, some years ago, Cheryl and I got a communication from an emergency room doctor who was called to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And he said that as he was trying unsuccessfully, I guess, as this guy was dying, the doctor said that he could experience that panorama of the man's life right there. And so, I don't understand it either. It is not possible within the realm of logic and logical connections that we have here in 2025 to put all this together. But that doesn't distress me very much because there's other kinds of thinking about things like this that don't run into those obstacles. So, I think this is going to open up in the next few decades as a really remarkable. It already is. There are a lot of doctors who are fascinated by this. Yeah.
Yeah, as you were saying this, I wonder if there's accounts of public executions, like hangings or whatever, where the people in the crowd experience what the person was suggesting.
Oh, my goodness. You got quite a mind there, Richard. I would have never thought of that. That's true. Yeah.
Well, it just reminded me what you said. That's why I wonder if that's happened. I pictured people like, someone in an electric chair and the audience is sitting there, and as they're being electrocuted, unfortunately, they hear stuff in their minds or they see stuff. So that's why. Then I thought of a hanging of all.
Yeah, well, it's like, I think who was it? Was it Samuel Johnson who said, the prospect of death eminently concentrates the mind? And it really does. Yeah.
Really interesting.
One way or another, everybody says that.
What's, I guess, Paul, we'll go back to you for a second. What's an NDE you heard about that just shocked you, that just really stands out in your mind, that it just like floored you? Then I want to ask you the same thing, Raymond.
I'll tell you one. Listen, but our new book deals with shared death experiences, and we have a number of different types of shared death experiences. And one of the ones that really got me is because I know all the principles in this story very well, and it's a type of shared death experience called a precognitive experience. A precognitive experience would be, you hear these all the time, frankly. I think it's one of the most common types of shared death experiences. It would be if someone wakes up and they know that a relative has died in a different part of the world, and they just know that, and then they find out that that is indeed true. This particular case happened probably, 10 or 15 years ago, and it happened to a very well-known Hollywood producer, and who was a woman, and her boyfriend who lived on the East Coast. She lives on the West Coast. And she was on the East Coast visiting her boyfriend. And early in the morning, she just got very, very uneasy feeling. She found it impossible to get back to sleep. And as the feeling kind of intensified, she began to think about members of her family, and then reached her father in thought and realized that he was in trouble and needed some kind of a help. She began to toss and turn. Her boyfriend awoke as well at the same time. They began to talk about the feelings they were both having, and then they were laying on their back, and they saw her father hovering above them for several moments. And as the producer said, it was strange but not creepy, was her quote. And as she went on to say, I looked at him, signs of distress or some other reason that he was there, but I just couldn't figure it out. Then it dawned on me that he was certainly dead and wanted to tell me himself. And she had always had a very strong bond with her father. Why her boyfriend got thrown in on this, I don't know. But he was also witnessing the father. She immediately called home and found out that her father had passed away from a heart attack unexpectedly. And that's one of the more bizarre experiences. To me, that's so bizarre because I know the people involved, so I know they're not, bullshitting us. But it clearly shows a separation of consciousness from the body, from a person who's dying. And
yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And that's really what researchers are looking for when they study life after death. They're studying consciousness leaving the corporeal body, because the study of consciousness is so amorphous anyway. It's hard to tell what it is. It's hard to describe it, but we all know we have consciousness.
And if you were to ask, where is the consciousness in your body? Where is the life in your body? It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But
exactly. And so this to me is a case that really emphasizes that somehow consciousness left her father's body and came and sought her out. And if you look at across the board in precognitive experiences, that's really what it indicates, is that somehow a dying person's consciousness leaves and seeks somebody out. And we have a lot of stories like that in this new book of ours. It's the new book, by the way, I got to tell you, Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe in an Afterlife. And it's a takeoff from Raymond's first groundbreaking book, actually, Life After Life.
So, Raymond, what's an NDE story that just shocked you, that you were amazed by?
Well, I've heard they're all amazing to me, right? And it's also amazing the commonality. But I'll say, Richard, one that is just continually amazing to me is as an aspect of Dr. George Ritchie's story. And Dr. George Ritchie was from Richmond, Virginia. He was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, where I met him in 1965. And to emphasize, George was from Richmond, Virginia. Okay. My mother and father are from Porterdale, Georgia. And George's experience took place about December 20th, 1943 at Camp Barkley, Texas. And when he was a recruit in the Army and developed double low pneumonia and was pronounced dead for 9 minutes at least. Okay, and his experience was just phenomenal. I mentioned his seeing into areas where the people were learning and such. But now I was greatly inspired with George, but I finished my PhD in philosophy at Virginia. I went and I taught philosophy in North Carolina. Then I went back to medical school in Georgia. So all this time gathering these experiences. In November of 1975, my book, Life After Life, which had been written a year before, was published. And 2 months later, I graduated from medical school in Georgia and decided I wanted to go back to Charlottesville, Virginia for my psychiatry residency. So in March of 76, after the book had been published and was already getting to be a bestseller, I think, back to Charlottesville in March to interview for my residency. And with Dr. Ritchie, I talked to him and he invited us over to dinner. Okay. And so next night I flew back to Macon, Georgia, where my parents lived and were taking care of my kids. And by then, my dad, who was a surgeon and a military officer and a surgeon, had heard a tape of Dr. Ritchie's experience. And my dad said the following words: George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. And it's very interesting. You know, I was there, and so were you. Mom and Dad had moved to Camp Barkley in early September 1943, so my dad could go to officers' candidate school. I was conceived late September. George's experience was December 20th. My mom and dad moved away from Camp Barkley December 29th, 1943. So I was there in utero when this experience that changed my life happens. And after that, there's just one thing after another like that. Well, some folks are now filming and making a film of George Ritchie's life. So I'm thinking, well, where are we going to film this? They thought, well, why not film it where it happened? So they looked into the property records, Richard, to see what's the fate of it now. And they found that it had been sold to a couple some years before who were going to make it into an exotic game farm. But once they moved there, this woman was thrown down in some sort of horrible accident and had a near-death experience. And, decided this is not the right way to proceed here. So now she's made that kind of place. I mean, it's just one incredible thing after another in my life has occurred because of George Ritchie. I mean, but that to me, one of the most, since I kind of in some mysterious way participated in that experience, I guess I have that's what I'm so fascinated by it.
Have you guys seen people of different faiths experience the same thing, or atheists versus Christians versus Muslims? Like, what are their experiences common or different or separate?
Religion only makes a semantic difference. The most common thing people say, some people have had this, they've no religion. Yeah, I've never thought about it, right? Other people have had various religions. The general drift of what people say is that if they had some religion, they say something like, I have to talk about this using terms and thought, ideas from my religion because those are the only terms I have. But that when people are impressed by that, it doesn't really have anything to do with religion. It's and some people stay with their religion. One woman I knew who was raised a Southern Baptist, converted to Catholicism simply because she said that what she saw there was she started reading, which she had never done after this experience, but she said the things that she found in the Catholic writings were the closest to her, but not that it wasn't an ideology, but that was just her decision. And then other people say that, that they may stick with the faith they have or move around, but the idea is it really doesn't have anything to do with religion.
Yeah.
Okay. What about from what I've heard, most of the NDEs corroborate the same things, but is there any NDEs that go against what other people have experienced that are contradictory?
Personally, I look at it as just a very broad spectrum, and that it's all done within the framework of like a kind of prelude to the whole thing is what almost everybody says. People who speak 10 languages, the people who have 50 degrees, they all say, I don't have any words. The great William James, the American psychologist, noted that as the most prominent feature of a near-death experience, that no matter how educated and articulate they may be, that there's no words, the ineffability of the near-death experience. But even within that limitation, there is for example, why is it that people all over the world that I've known talk about it as a travel narrative? I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a line, I saw my life in review, came back to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative. And at the same time, think of it, Richard, but the presuppositions going into the narrative, they say, well, there are no words for it. And also it wasn't in space. This was not a spatial place or I was in, and no time passed. But when under those preconditions you put it into a travel narrative, it's like it's obviously not the kind of normal travel narrative, because if there's no space and no time, then how can you have travel? So my point on harping on this is a very important part of how we come to understand this. When Lincoln was president, there was some very formal state ceremony. I forgot the details, but whatever his part called for him, all these people were gathered around. And his part called for him to get up on a horse, mount a horse, and to lead a procession away from the scene. But when in the midst of all these people, when Lincoln got up on his horse, the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse, dancing around, and people were shocked into an embarrassed silence. Like, oh, poor Mr. Lincoln, how awkward in this solemn occasion. So Lincoln just looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody just dissolved into laughter. Well, if you think about it, that makes no sense to say that a horse could get on its back thing, mounting and stirring. Yeah, but it creates a very vivid image in the mind of that very thing happening. And that's what these accounts of near-death experiences do. They are giving us some kind of intimation of things that we can't really comprehend yet until maybe we get in the midst of them. And even then, people come back and say, very humbled by this, saying that, it exposes them to a little tip of a mystery that they realize is much vaster than the little bit that they saw.
What would be cool if you partnered someone with an NDE with someone that had a really powerful movie making package, and they recreated the NDE as best as they could at the instruction of the person that had it, and they try to make a movie of it that the person could watch and say, oh, that's not accurate, and edit it to the point where they're like, yeah, that's kind of like what I experienced.
Yes, there's been a few people who've tried that kind of thing, but I tell you, since I can't even operate my Kodak Polaroid camera here, I'm lost on that side. But the premise I would think of here, Richard, is creativity, right? That this is a great wellspring of creativity. And this is pretty rare, but I have nonetheless over the years heard a number of cases of people who had zero, artistic interest or talent before one of these, but who come back after a near-death experience. And like one woman I met decades ago in Toronto, who was elderly, and she was award-winning artist in Toronto, but she brought me her pictures or paintings to my lecture because the way she became an artist was because of her near-death experience. It opened this creativity up. And what in the name of God is creativity? It's, to me, a paranormal experience. Creativity is a far more paranormal experience to me than listening to a medium say, oh, did she have a green cat? Or, all that stuff. But, what is creativity? The Greeks thought it was divine beings, the muses. And guess what? That's what a lot of artists I know still think. Right? I hear it all the time. It doesn't come from me. It comes through me. And that's what I feel about my work most of the time. It's like, if you're trying to do it, it's hard. But if you just let it flow, I think that creativity itself is something extraordinary, and it's not too surprising to me, therefore, that it would be unleashed something as extraordinary as a near-death experience.
And I've heard the memories of these are really at very high fidelity, even for decades after. Is that what you've encountered?
Yeah. And also infused with a sense of nostalgia for it. It's a kind of longing to be back there, or a homesickness for that state.
Well, I thought of, I know we're getting into one particular religion, but I thought of like the Gospels and Christianity, and people saying, oh, how could they remember this decades later? Well, if they had an experience with God himself, then I thought, it's probably like a near-death experience. And that preserves the memory of that really strongly, so they could write about it with a very high degree of accuracy decades later.
Well, Paul in the Bible definitely had a near-death experience. And that was his conversion experience, frankly, when he had a really powerful, I think he was being stoned by passersby because they didn't like the fact that he was a tax collector. But he did have a spontaneous moment with light, with the divine light. And that was his transforming experience in the Bible.
Yeah, like they say the book of John was written, let's say, in the year 90, which would have been 57 years after. How could he have remembered? But again, since he hung out with God himself, it's like a near-death experience. And he remembered everything, it would be my guess. So this is thought I had.
I mean, a lot of these were hand-me-down information. Doesn't mean the information is wrong. If you deal with the Coptic Christians in Egypt, they believe that oral tradition is class A information. And that's what they call it.
Richard.
It's as good as the Bible to hear oral tradition.
And Richard, if you were projected back to say, the year 0, you wouldn't be able to believe what you were seeing with the people around you, because they would appear to you to be supernatural beings. And the reason is their memory, because we have writing, right? They had no writing. And so if you're living out in the boondocks in a farm, as most were, and you could go into the big city once a year on your wagon to get supplies, how are you going to keep your list, right? Well, the way people in antiquity did it was they had what they call memory theaters. And that is that everybody in the society would presumably know a certain building, right? They would know the city hall or the administrative building by heart. So then when they're making the list, they'll say, well, I'll put the barrel of flour and the alcove to the city hall, and the grease for my machinery and the tax office. And then when they would go back in, on doing that, they would just be reading that from their memory theater. But to us who don't use that kind of technique, it would appear phenomenal because we use lists.
And to go to Coptic Christians for a moment, a lot of their history was not written down. They kind of came into the being, if you will, in the 4th century, and their history would go into hymns that were not written down. And the hymns would, in a way, and sort of like Homer, for instance, they would carry the information about their religion, about their myths, their beliefs, and everyone knew these songs. And if someone sang them wrong, they would correct them. So this was, and I think the memory theater would be a similar thing, is that the society would correct them because they all knew the hymns. And it wasn't until, I think the 19th century that Coptic Christian hymns were translated. And and they feel as though that was Class A information, as good as the scriptures.
Okay, interesting.
And there's a lot of cultures like that. I mean, Raymond's, he's big on the Greeks. And obviously that happened with Homer's work, don't you think?
Yeah, there was some kind of, the way the language was structured, it was called cross correspondences. Like the oral literature was put together in such a way that there was these geographic points or these geometric points in it, as it were, to aid the memory. And they had all kinds of memory things that we just don't use anymore because once writing came, there was no more need for them.
I think that's the kind of thing that crossed into a lot of societies. Their ability to have a method of carrying their own history, and songs are perfect for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, all right, well, we're close to wrapping up. So the new book, is it out yet or is it about to be out? Let's restate the title so that the listeners can get it.
Yeah, the new book is Proof of Life After Life. Subtitle is 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife. And this is the new book. It really plays off of Raymond's first huge book, Life After Life, which was published in 78, right, Raymond?
75.
75.
I was published in 75 when I was born.
Wow.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But the beauty of this new book is that it focuses on shared death experiences. Because a shared death experience is shared, it's an objective experience. It becomes objective. So a near-death experience itself, because it's not shared by anybody, is subjective. And once you get more than 2 people who can experience the same, more than 1 person actually, that can experience the same experience, that becomes objective.
Actually, one more thing comes to mind. This would be an unusual situation, but has there been where a woman was pregnant and she had a near-death experience when she was however far along, and then years later, the kid was born, they grew up, and they have some knowledge somehow of that they wouldn't normally have because their mother had that experience with them in utero?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they would have
Remembering.
they would have a different view of life if they heard that they had almost died and that the mother had an NDE. They could possibly remember an NDE, I guess, don't you think?
I know you very well, this man who almost died when he was born and had a distinct memory of coming into like a pink room when he was born. But he almost died and had to be resuscitated during this delivery. Years later, he told his father and mother, some years when he was, I guess, once he could start talking about, 8 or 9 or 10, he started telling his mother and father about his near-death experience, leaving his body and staying in this pink room. And they, just of course didn't think anything of it until for some reason they happened to know the doctor. They were in the military, and this was in a foreign nation where the event took place. So some time later, the father got to talking again with the doctor on the military base who delivered his son, and told him that story. And the doctor said, well, as a matter of fact, that they had painted the room pink, but the reason was simply that was the only paint they had, and they needed to paint the room.
Oh, yeah, wow.
But, there are a lot of mystifying things about this, Richard, that are just, beyond impossible to compute when we're thinking in normal logic. And that may tear some people apart, but there is something beyond ordinary logic, which is just as vigorous and just as rigorous and well thought out, by which you can understand these things better. But, that's draws most people to this is narratives. They love the wonderful stories and inspiring stories. But if they, it's not something that most people are not interested in concepts. But for those who are just conceptual thinkers, there's ways through this. So, yeah. And so I'm confident to say, and I gather there is life after death. I give up. I just don't know how to think my way out of it.
Well, yeah. So last question, I know, just guessing, how many near-death experiences have you heard about, both of you?
Thousands, I'm sure.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, definitely. Yeah, I often get into the same thing with homicides. How many homicides have I homicide killers, that is, that I talked to. And it's at least 300. But then, it's amazing how quickly you forget. You lose track. And, if you're seeing in a forensic unit, 15 or 20 different people over a day have killed people, you lose track. So it's the same thing. It's like there's such an overwhelming number
that brings to mind one more question, if I may. You said you've spoken to over 300 killers. Did they, this is a terrible thing, but as they were killing the person, did they get anything from the person? Did they have experience of their experience?
Never heard anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I never heard from one of my homicide people. I never heard them talk about a near-death experience or any kind of unusual paranormal experience when they were killing somebody or anything like that.
Okay, gotcha. So, yeah, very good. This has been an amazing interview. I'm really glad to speak to both of you. For listeners, what would be the first way to dip their toe in to learn more about this besides this interview? Should they get the newest book, their oldest book? How should they start?
Our current book is great, but then my old book, Life After Life, is also everywhere available. And then Paul and I have some, numbers of books, but maybe we should tell my website is called lifeafterlife.com. And Paul's website is?
It's glimpsesofeternity.com. And that's named after one of our books. Or it's paulperryproductions.com.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, again, both of you, it's been awesome. And I really appreciate both of you being here. Thank you.
Yeah, Richard, thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.